welcome to the Chicago Discography Review
And more.
podcast. Yes, indeed. We got Dan Caro,
What's up?
Scott Caro,
What's up?
absolute relation. My name is Owen Strain. We are in the fucking swampland, Louisiana, and we're just going to be listening to Chicago's records, and we're going to talk about them. We're going to rank them. We're going to fight and cry and, you know, going to have a good time. So thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoy it. Whatever we wind up here with our maiden voyage episode, I'm sure we're going to refine our process as we go along. We're going to start with the first record, naturally. Chicago Transit Authority, 1969.
Yep.
Nice.
Excellent. Scott, give us a little bit of a datum about this record.
All right. Chicago Transit Authority came out in 1969 in April 28th. It was actually recorded in January over 4 days. And the
4 days they recorded this fucking record?
4 days they recorded the record.
Bunch of assholes.
In Columbia Studios in New York City. All right. So this is, a very quick little project.
New York City!
New York.
Get a rope.
But it was produced by James William Guercio, who was also their manager. He's kind of the guy who discovered him. He had a little bit of a background. He played like with the Dick Clark All-Star Touring Band, and members of Chicago actually played with that band before they formed the band Chicago. And he kind of discovered them, and when they were still in Chicago, he moved the band to Los Angeles. Their career from
New York?
Chicago.
From Chicago.
Yeah. That's why they call
These
themselves
guys
Chicago.
are based out of Omaha, right?
So yeah, basically he moved the band to Los Angeles and got them to rehearse and got them in the clubs in Los Angeles. He had some connections, but kind of most importantly is that he ended up producing the second Blood, Sweat and Tears album, which is Blood, Sweat and Tears self-titled album. But this is the band that Chicago, especially early in their career, is going to be compared with the most. Chicago versus Blood, Sweat, and Tears. The idea of jazz rock is kind of a thing at this time, and that's what's happening here. Chicago,
It's like an oxymoron, right? Jazz rock.
Chicago is perceived as kind of riding the coattails of Blood, Sweat, and Tears. All right, but Chicago actually was formed first, but Blood, Sweat, and Tears had industry connections. Al Cooper was the leader of Blood, Sweat, and Tears. This is the guy who played organ on Like a Rolling Stone, the Bob Dylan track. So Blood, Sweat, and Tears got a record out very quickly upon their formation, but Chicago actually preceded them, but they were perceived as being some sort of copycat of Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And that was kind of not helped by the fact that Chicago's manager, James William Guercio, produced the second Blood, Sweat, and Tears album, which reached number one. It was a huge hit album, but he only did it as leverage to get Chicago signed. Clive Davis had reservations about signing Chicago. Columbia Records, I don't know what his official title was at the time, but Clive Davis, you know the name.
Definitely heard that.
Clive Davis was in charge of signing, he was the president of the label or whatever. And this was how Chicago got signed, by Guercio agreeing to produce this Blood, Sweat, and Tears 2 album.
Nice.
Not 2, but self-titled, but their second album. That album was hugely successful, but again, it was not something that he was really into doing, But that fueled the kind of idea that Chicago was just some sort of also-ran at first, for the early part of Chicago's career. The album was a double album, which was controversial in itself because the label wouldn't pay for a double album. So
The first Chicago record was a double
the first
album.
three
First
were double
three
albums.
records, yeah.
Yeah. So this was controversial, especially for a brand new artist. The label didn't want to pay for it, so Guercio convinced the band to basically pay for the second disc. Columbia was willing to pay for a single album. Chicago just paid the bill for the second disc out of their royalties. So that's how the album got made. That's how the album got made, And again, it was recorded in 4 days. There's a lot of stories about the band attempting to record live.
How many tracks on this record? 14?
Well,
Basically 11. It depends
11.
on
That's how you
Chicago's.
categorize what a track
That's
is,
the
a song
thing.
is. Yeah.
The first few Chicago albums, actually not so much this one. The only thing I can think of on here that you might break into 2 tracks, because I think the original album was Prologue and Someday.
We're going to have to talk about that little bit later on.
That's the
But
thing.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
like Chicago 2 and Chicago 3 especially, they have like these suites of songs where
Mm-hmm.
you can categorize these as one song or as their individual parts.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that's just something about Chicago's early work.
I mean, making a record in 4 days, 11 tunes in 4 days. Like, by today's standards, that's
That's not gonna work.
like unheard of.
Yeah.
It's like they're fucking booking out the studio for weeks, if not a month or two, or more, and it's all just overdubs and, just uber multi-tracking,
Well, that's what they say.
Bananas.
They try to record it live because I mean that's kind of just what they were about. They're very much a live band. They Chicago toured for the first, I mean, I don't know, like 20 something years of their career, 300 plus days a year. So they're very much a live act. Their following was built up very organically as a live act, playing in clubs first and then getting noticed and being taken out as a supporting act on tours of people like Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and so on, and also playing big festivals at the time, late 60s. Chicago formed in 1967, and their first album wasn't released until mid-69, April 69, and recorded in January 69.
That's a pretty big window.
Give it a time frame, right? So and they formed in Chicago, right? So forming in Chicago, playing in Chicago, becoming one of the big bands in Chicago, right? And then being discovered by Gershio and then being moved to Los Angeles and establishing themselves all over again as the big band in LA at the time.
Yeah.
Right. And then getting taken out on the road, and that's really how they built a following before they ever had an album. Right.
Now, you guys, Dan and Scott, your brothers, you grew up listening to this stuff. So, I'm rather kind of a new initiate to the Chicago, but you guys have this stuff like ingrained in the back of your head, right? I mean, Dan, you're a professional musician. You're a drummer, a pretty accomplished drummer, if I might say so. How did this band in particular, or even this record, kind of speak to your pathway and kind of, lead you, listening to your dad blow in the living room, right? Blow his trumpet
Yeah, our dad
against
was a
these
trumpet
tunes,
player,
right?
Yeah, that's how it all started. I mean, basically on the weekends, our dad would take out his horn and start blowing along to these songs, and that's his earliest memories of music for me was Chicago and Blood, Sweat, and Tears, because he loves both bands pretty much.
And other bands in that sort of ilk, Tower
Sure.
Power, things like that.
Right, but he would blow along to Chicago. He didn't seem to know the other songs,
Right.
but he knew some of the Chicago melodies.
He had
So-
been in the band that played these covers when he was in his 20s.
Nice.
Yeah. So it was really influential on me just, getting these sounds in my ear, and sort of having two older brothers, Scott and our oldest brother, John. They're both horn players. Scott's a bone player and Johnny's a trumpet player, just like our dad. Hearing that brass sound, that horn sound, and that element that didn't exist in a lot of the rock and roll of the day. It existed in some R&B forms in the day, but not as like a lead primary focal point of the band. So that was a new experience for me, even at a young age, hearing it's a different timbre, it's a different focal point. And not only did they take the lead role a lot of the time, but their supplemental roles filled in a lot of the spaces that other horn bands of the day and even preceding that time period in the R&B genres didn't really function the same way. So I didn't understand that. I didn't know what the theory behind it was like I do now, but back then it just sounded so different to me and so filled and surrounding the sound. It was just a powerful voice for me.
I mean, our entry into this band, all right, I was maybe a sophomore in high school, and Danny was probably in like 8th grade or something, right? And I had started playing in the high school band and stuff, and I just became interested in this band because they had horns, and I knew all the music because our dad liked the very beginning of Chicago's career, but couldn't care less about anything past that. I mean, he had CTA through 5, and then he also had 13, which is weird, but he didn't care about anything but those records. And he didn't like 13, so he had it, but he didn't like it. But he liked CTA 2, 3, and 5. 4 is the live album. But That was it, and I started listening to those albums. So to me, you know, at its root, although I'm not, there's a lot of in Chicago fandom. There's a lot of people who are like, I like the Terry Kath era, and that's it. The hell with David Foster, the hell with Peter Cetera, the '80s, You're the Inspiration, and all that. But weirdly enough, for me, You're the Inspiration in particular is a song that I was very aware of. I was the right age when that was a hit single.
Now, You're the Inspiration is a Chicago tune, not a Peter Cetera tune?
No, it's a Chicago tune. Right. This is the last album Peter Cetera was in Chicago.
Because I only ever associate that with Peter Cetera.
Yeah, I was the right age, 84. I would have been 8 years old to hear that song, and I remember knowing the name Chicago for the first time through that song.
Yeah.
And then, you know, when I was in high school, when I started playing music myself, my dad was like, "Oh, you like trombone? Like, listen to this." And of course, I knew all the songs. I mean, we grew up. My dad was a big music fan, like we said, like, you know. And I recognize Beginnings, and Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is, and Make Me Smile, and all the great Chicago hits, and even album tracks, because we had heard these in the den on the weekends when my dad was listening to this stuff. So I knew it all. I didn't know that it was Chicago. I didn't know it was the same band. I remember that was one of the first things that blew me away about Chicago, was like, wait, I know You're the Inspiration, this hit song that's current, that's now. Actually, by the time I got into Chicago, it wasn't now, but I remembered You're the Inspiration, and Chicago's like Look Away. 1989, I'm in 8th grade or something when that comes out. You know the song Look Away? That ballad from the late 80s?
I'd know it if I heard it.
You would know it.
You would know it. Hands down, you would
Huge
know
hit.
it.
Yeah.
All right? All that stuff, I was very aware. Chicago was very prominent at the time in this sort of adult, contemporary, love ballad, pop shit, you know, like that they were doing at the time. They were very they were very much a player in that scene, on the charts, you know. But getting into the original era of Chicago at the time happened when I was a freshman or a sophomore, and you were like in 8th grade or something like that. And you could like look at the mixtape. Back in those days, you'd make mixtapes off the radio.
You know, that was actually a tape of mixed music.
And you'd be waiting with your hand on the play and record button for the next song to come on the radio station.
On the radio.
You know, and you could see our mixtapes all of a sudden go from like Crisscross, Jump, what else?
Tone Loc and Young
Paula
MC,
Abdul,
Paula Abdul,
Digital Underground, all that stuff. All of a sudden, I remember I had a mixtape, but it was like Digital Underground, and then the next track was like Lowdown by Chicago, and that was it.
Chicago 3.
It never stopped from that point on. It was the next mixtape I made was entirely Chicago.
Crisscross. You know, I knew one of those kids from Crisscross.
You serious?
Yeah, I had him in one of my classes when I was teaching at a private school in Atlanta.
Oh yeah.
And you know, he was kind of in his early 20s.
Didn't one of them pass away or something?
Yeah, just recently.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that was him. He was a good
really?
kid. He was a super talent. Got nothing to do with Chicago, but he was a good kid.
Our dad had this like little motivational tape for insurance purposes because he was an insurance salesman. I can only remember it as a white tape with a pink label.
Yeah.
And the lead-off song was "Alive Again" off of Chicago Hot Streets.
Yeah.
The album right after
Chicago
the 12th album, right after Terry Kath had passed away, and they released a new record.
It's another hit song that you probably know that you just don't know you know yet.
Yeah.
You know, as you get, and again, like Owen is not someone who grew up listening to this music. He comes from a whole different musical background. So in a lot of ways, this is his discovery. You know, Danny and I are kind of bringing him into the fold.
At that time, you know, 8th grade, I was a metalhead, punk rock, you know, Misfits, Metallica, you know.
Okay, so Chicago, after it was released, it was a slow-growing album. It took a while for it to reach its peak. It ultimately peaks at number 17 in the U.S. and number 9 in the U.K., and that was in July of 1969. So remember, it came out at the very end of April. So what is that? April?
3 months.
3 months
That's
it took
fine.
for the album to reach its peak. Chicago. It's their first album. Like I said, it's faster than maybe some first albums because they had built up such a large following playing live and going on all these tours and playing rock festivals and stuff like that. But it's not an instant hit. Like I said, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, you know, the album that is sort of most compared to this because it was produced by Chicago's manager was an immediate hit. You know,
Immediate is like a month.
probably. I didn't do a lot of research on that, but it was an immediate hit. It had some number ones. It had hit singles. Chicago's not going to have hit singles. Singles off of this album, Question 67 and 68. Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is? Beginnings and I'm a Man much later on is going to be released as a single. But the thing is, all of those singles, when they were released the first time, failed to chart. They had to re-release those singles after they became more prominent. It was Chicago 2 that really broke the band on AM radio. And that's something that people don't really kind of understand the difference in like AM and FM at this time. FM was more like album oriented, right? AM was hit radio. AM was top 40 radio, right? Today, I mean, not today, FM, AM, what the hell? We're on spot.
Radio.
Radio.
I still listen to it.
Yeah, right. But back then, you know, obviously radio is important. But like when we were kids, B97 in New Orleans was the big pop radio station, but that's an FM station, right? That was a big difference. Like I don't know exactly when that shifted. Probably over the course of the 70s, as you know, as
WTIX was the
WTIX.
Yeah, that's the long term.
That's
AM station.
But I'm talking about when we were kids in the 80s.
Oh, right.
FM was you didn't listen to AM.
No.
AM was dead, right? AM was like local talk radio, news radio, and all that, right?
And Jesus.
In the 60s and even into the early 70s, AM was where Tom Jones tracks were played. FM was where, you know, Iron Butterfly tracks were played, right? You see what I'm saying? It was much more of like this album-oriented, deep cuts kind of thing. So Chicago became, you know, more of an FM type band at the time. But to have a hit single, you had to be on AM radio. That doesn't happen for Chicago until the second album. So they're going to re-release these singles later on. Question 6, 7, 68, does anybody really know what time it is? Beginnings, and later I'm a Man as a B-side. And those are only going to become hits after Make Me Smile from Chicago 2 has already been a hit. See what I'm saying? So it's going to take Make Me Smile to create that top 40 breakthrough. You know, then they re-release these other tracks as singles later on. But Question 6, 7, 68 is the first single release from this album. We'll talk more about that when we get to the album. But yeah, so the album peaks at number 17. So is it a smash hit? No. But this is what's interesting about the album. It spends 171 weeks in the Billboard Top 200, which was at the time,
That's a long ass time.
a record. All right. It broke the record at 155 weeks, and that was in October of 74, and it spent another 8 months on the charts after that.
5 years.
So it shattered the record at the time for longest run on the Billboard Top 200. That's been surpassed many times over now, but at the time,
Yeah, that was huge.
this is a classic album. It's significant, you know. Like
It didn't have any initial hits.
didn't have any
Yeah.
hits, right?
And
This is
still-
totally like a live band, like I said, a word of mouth type thing.
Now, what do you attribute that to? I mean, is that they're touring and grinding and just building that following and really kind of worming themselves into people's heads? You know,
Well, they were
Is it-
touring with was it Hendrix at the
Hendrix
time?
and Janis Joplin, two different, and they did all them big rock festivals.
Yeah, so they were prominent in sort of a,
expanding
a
that
more rock
audience.
and roll underground scene. They weren't so much pop in the pop radio scene.
So it seems pretty clear that rock scene, you know, the Woodstock scene, as it were. I mean, they were taken to Chicago.
Right.
They were hearing it on those tours. They were going to see the headliner acts, obviously, but they were getting exposed to this kind of obscure, something a little different that wasn't quite in the vein of what they were kind of going to see. But it was catching on. It was taking a hold. It was striking a chord.
I think Chicago's musicianship did that for them. You know, like they are a great live band. They have incredible individual instrumentalists. Peter
How many
Cetera,
bodies on stage at the time?
7. in
Seven
the
bodies
original
on stage
iteration.
at the time. Who else was doing 7 bodies on the stage at the time?
Well, that's what Sirius had 10. Tower of Power comes on the scene right after, and they have a 10-piece band. So, you know, Chicago, though, that's something we're definitely going to talk about over the course of this podcast, is this whole Chicago versus Blood, Sweat, and Tears versus even things, something like Tower of Power, you know. I'll tell you what else was on the chart at the time. Like I said, Chicago peaks at number 17 in the summer of its release, 1969. So on the chart at the time, you have, as far as albums go, the number one album in the same week Chicago hits its peak at number 17, you have the Hair soundtrack. You familiar with Hair?
Yeah.
Okay, now here's what's interesting about Hair. This is crazy because it's very connected to Chicago. Danny, do you even know? Like, who is a cast member of Hair.
No Googling, don't cheat.
I'm pulling up the top singles for
Right on.
1960.
Donnie, I'm about to tell you. Don't
Singles, not albums.
worry. I got singles too.
Okay.
Donnie Dacus was
Oh,
in
he
the
was
cast of Hair.
Oh, I didn't know that.
This is going to be the replacement for Terry Kath in Chicago.
Oh, boy.
Right? So it's kind of an interesting little connection that Donnie Dacus. And look, to be honest, I haven't done the research. This is probably the original cast recording. Blood, Sweat, and Tears in that week was number 3, so it was kind of declining at that time. It had already hit number 1. It's declining. Fifth Dimension, Age of Aquarius. These are albums. That's at number 4. The Who, Tommy, number 7. Bob Dylan, Nashville Skyline, number 8. Crosby, Stills and Nash, first album, the self-titled, number 10. And Led Zeppelin 1, number 16. Remember, Chicago's peak is number 17, so there's Led Zeppelin 1's right before that.
Huh.
So that's the week of Chicago's peak. Hit singles in that same week.
Week of the peak.
Week of the peak, right. So hit singles in that same time. Spinning Wheel, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, massive hit off that one Blood, Sweat, and Tears album that was produced by Guercio. Crystal Blue Persuasion, Tommy James and the Shondells. Ballad of John and Yoko and Get Back were the 2 Beatles songs in the charts at the time. My Cherie Amour, Stevie Wonder. Bad Moon Rising, Creedence. And In the Ghetto, Elvis.
So why did you pick those to reference?
Those
just
were the
now?
most well-known. I'm just giving you a context of what was in the charts at the time. What was the musical environment in which this album was released?
Right.
You know, and that's it. I mean, so that's the context of when this album hit its peak, right? 17. That was what was going on in the charts. Now remember, I mean, this album was in the charts for so long. That doesn't tell the whole story of the album, but that's in the moment of its release when this album was at its most popular. That was the musical scene at the time, right there. So that's basically, the context of the release of this album.
I'm going to follow up just slightly on that. The Temptations had some hits in there. The Stones had some hits. Creedence Clearwater Revival had like 3 or 4 hits during there.
Over the course of the year.
Over the course, this
Right.
is in the
This is for the
Billboard
whole
Top
year.
100, right? Sly had some hits. Sly and Stone had some hits.
This is
in
the
there.
year of Woodstock.
Right. the year of
1969
Woodstock.
is the year of Woodstock.
So
Blood, Sweat, and Tears played Woodstock. Sly
Right.
Stone played Woodstock. These are almost like competitors for Chicago at the time because they have horns, basically. And that's what makes them sort of Chicago's competition.
But it seemed right, exactly, and the actual year 1969 in the Billboard charts is very eclectic, and I mean I know it always is, but in terms of like the acts at Woodstock being as eclectic as it was, I mean Sha Na Na was there, Blood, Sweat and Tears was there, Janice was there.
Sha Na Na, I
You
saw
know,
them
that's
in the
a
charts.
crazy dynamic. Tom Jones was in there. The Beatles were in there. Creedence, Three Dog Night was in there. The Sugar, the Archies, Fifth Dimension. I mean, these are all so radically different from one another.
Even within that week, the week of the peak, as it were. I mean, other than Blood, Sweat, and Tears, there's a whole kind of span of nothing like Chicago,
Right. And that's the thing. This is a time period where anything was an acceptable experiment in music, even pop music. Anything was an acceptable experiment. And actually, that's still true, like into the early 70s, I would say. But really, that had peaked in 67 with the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album, and other albums at the time. Rolling Stones did Satanic Majesties that year. That's like, like bands like King Crimson are out there. There's like and this is kind of something we should talk about here, because this is kind of a, Chicago is one of these kind of bands that its fans are kind of always defending, And one way that its fans kind of defend the band, I would kind of equate them with like a Billy Joel in that respect, Like Billy Joel's never been cool, but it's pretty cool, Matter of fact, Billy Joel is probably more cool now than he's ever been, Because at the time he was kind of seen as, just kind of, I mean, you know what I'm talking about. He's white bread, you know what I'm saying? And Chicago is kind of ended up in that same category, which is weird when this is their first album and it's not a big hit single driven album, and it's very experimental and really avant-garde. that it fits well into this kind of experimental time frame. But Chicago very much becomes this kind of band driven by hit singles as they progress. But at the time, you know, when you kind of compare what's going on out there, it was a time period that was, you know, anything goes. And that's because, like I said, the whole dichotomy between FM radio and AM radio, you know, Chicago essentially was a college rock band. That's, you know, college rock. That's something that like REM or something like later on symbolizes this idea of college rock. Maybe later on, even later, bands like Modest Mouse and things like that, if you're familiar with that, Built to Spill, this kind of indie shit that comes about later. Chicago was that. When they put this album out, that's what they were, you know? They were this college band. The college radio stations picked up on Chicago. FM stations picked up on Chicago. They were not played on AM radio. So all the success, most of the things that I chose to mention here, I mentioned because it sets the context for what this album was released into. But these are also timeless albums for the most part, you know?
Yeah, I mean,
Led
a lot of that
Zeppelin
stuff,
one?
a lot of that stuff that was on those charts at the time, we're still familiar with. You know?
Totally,
And
exactly. Household like names, you know. People who aren't music fans are familiar with a lot of this stuff. Crystal Blue Persuasion, 2 Beatles hits at the time. Beatles at the end of their career. My Cherie Amour. Who doesn't know that song?
Who doesn't love that song?
Who doesn't love that song? Even Elvis Presley is still in it at this time.
A Boy Named Sue, Johnny Cash was in
Johnny
it.
Cash, right. I didn't write down every single thing, but
Right.
yeah, that's out there.
These
you know?
Eyes, the Guess Who.
These Eyes,
you know?
right.
Yeah.
So, and I think we're going to talk more about this when we get into the track by track kind of thing here. But speaking of production and stuff, you know, I think that Chicago Transit Authority definitely fits in. Like, even with something like the Let It Be album, you know, even with something like those Three Dog Night and Guess Who albums, that's Chicago Transit Authority from a production standpoint fits right into that.
I find it interesting that the Doors haven't been mentioned at all in this.
They had a hit. Touch Me was a hit in 1969.
69, that's getting to
I
the
mean,
end
that
of the
was
Doors career.
towards the very end.
Jimi Hendrix, this was the year of Electric Ladyland. Jimi Hendrix, 1969.
That was his last record.
last
His
record,
last
yeah.
record.
Yeah.
Well, no, his last record with the Experience. He later on did Band of Gypsies with Buddy Miles and all that.
Well, that was still 69, wasn't it?
69 70. It was New Year's. The show was New Year's.
Yeah.
At the Fillmore.
Yeah.
But he even was recording another album that eventually was sort of released in some sort of form in the 90s.
Posthumously, yeah.
First Rays and New Rising Sun.
Yeah.
But he had plenty of recordings
Material.
after 69. He wasn't able to officially release an album again.
They're
after
still
this.
releasing this stuff.
A studio
They still
album,
have unreleased
Yeah.
tracks.
It's like Tupac.
Yeah.
It's good though. I mean,
Yeah.
all that Jimi Hendrix stuff that comes out late is he's going in a different direction. I like it a lot. So again, we talked about the staying power of this album, and we talked about the fact that Chicago kind of built their following very organically, and that kind of they got some recognition in their first year, even though they didn't have a hit single, even though their peak position on the Billboard chart was 17. They did get some recognition from the industry, and
And 17 is not insignificant.
no, it's not insignificant at all. But I'm saying, you know, in a year, we've already talked about all the the singles and the albums that came out that year. But Chicago was nominated for Best New Artist at the Grammy Awards in 1970 on the strength of his first album. Best New Artist of 69 at the 70 Grammy ceremony. So they were nominated. Here are the nominees: Chicago, Led Zeppelin, you know, something called Oliver. I looked it up, and Neon Philharmonic. Oliver and Neon Philharmonic. I looked those both up, but they left so little impression on me, I've forgotten now what they were. I
It
looked these
wasn't
up
like
about
the
a year ago.
musical.
Oliver had a hit in. Yeah, he had.
Yeah,
whatever
it was an album. It was new at the time. Whatever it was, I don't even remember. I looked this up about a week ago. Obviously, Chicago and Led Zeppelin, Oliver, Neon Philharmonic, and the fifth nominee who won was Crosby, Stills and Nash, Best New Artist of the Year.
I mean, their vocal harmonies were.
Do
just
you agree
stellar.
now in hindsight? Who's the winner of the Best New Artist in 1969? Let me list them again: Chicago, Led Zeppelin, Oliver, Neon Philharmonic, or Crosby, Stills, and Nash? Who's the real winner?
Okay.
Crosby, Stills, and Nash was the real winner.
How long was
What?
Zeppelin on the scene?
Led Zeppelin, come on.
No.
They're the clear.
No.
In
come
retrospect,
on.
in retrospect,
Nah.
Led Zeppelin has got to be the
I
winner.
don't know about that. I think
Of that
yes,
conversation.
Crosby, Stills,
No,
and Nash.
I think Crosby, Stills, and Nash, their vocalizations and their harmonies and their songwriting.
I think Chicago's
was
vocals
stellar.
were on the level of Crosby, Stills, and Nash.
Well, and that paired with the horn
I don't agree
action.
with you.
I agree. But for sheer kind of power, I think Zeppelin all the way.
Absolutely.
Okay, what year?
Not even power, just like who matters the most now is what I'm saying.
Sure.
In retrospect, I'm asking.
And this
who
was
really
Zeppelin's-
should have won this Best New Artist Award in 1969? That's hands down. Crosby, Stills, and Nash put out a couple albums before they self-destructed. Led Zeppelin is a goddamn
Force of
legacy,
nature.
a
Yeah.
force of nature. Led Zeppelin should have won this thing, man.
Yeah, I guess.
Chicago even has a
It's-
claim to it.
Sure.
Chicago is one
Sure.
of the biggest selling American artists of
They're a rock and roll
their
band.
3 decades
they
of
don't have
relevance.
They don't have as much recognizable melody, and their
Melody?
songs aren't as shaped. It's not as well constructed.
Chicago has
talking
more
about
hit
Zeppelin.
singles than any of
Zeppelin
them.
versus CS.
Chicago has
At the
far more
time-
Stills and
hits.
Nash.
At the time, they weren't. Yes, in retrospect,
We're talking in retrospect.
Yes.
We're saying with hindsight, who should have won this award?
Zeppelin should have won it.
Zeppelin
but
should have
at
won.
the time, the perspective was such that you're right.
Crosby,
the-
Stills, and Nash won because people knew Crosby, Stills, and Nash. It was a
Structurally,
supergroup.
Structure,
You know,
it was a
compositionally,
supergroup.
Yeah.
Graham
was a
Nash was in the Hollies, David
They
Crosby in the
already had
Byrds,
success.
and Stills was in Buffalo Springfield.
That's right.
That's why they won the award.
Possibly. But
Actually, I'm going Oliver should have won this shit.
yeah.
yeah,
I'm
hands
taking a
down.
stand
Who's that
right
other?
here.
Who's that other Philharmonic group? Look,
Anyway, yeah,
between
so-
Zeppelin and Crosby, Stills and Nash, whatever. Okay, so the rock and roll band that takes a little bit more raw approach and more jammy, fine. But that's not really what the masses eat out.
At the time.
At
it's not-
any
But
time.
remember, it's not the masses
At any-
who choose the winner of this award. It's the Academy
It's
of
the
Recording Arts and
Academy, yeah,
Sciences.
to be sure.
Right?
And they're fed by the masses, the public that buy
They're
records.
fed by...
It's like
And
the
it's
electoral
been-
college.
These are-
It's
these
like
are
the
all pros.
faithless
That's what-
electors of the electoral college.
Exactly.
I guess.
They picked the old faithful, the old pros, Crosby, Stills. I love Crosby, Stills, and Nash first 2 albums.
Sure.
Don't get me wrong. I love those first 2 albums, right? But really, even as an album, because remember, they're doing this on the strength of a new album. This is the best new artist category. So they got 1 album for each of these artists to judge. Led
Best
Zeppelin's
new
first
artist.
album, Chicago's first album, is superior to Crosby, Stills, and Nash self-titled.
Okay.
See, Chicago Transit Authority is a superior album to CSN.
Yes.
Led Zeppelin 1
Yes.
is superior
Maybe,
to both of them.
Maybe.
Okay, in retrospect.
Maybe.
But
In retrospect.
I think at the time,
Yeah.
Chicago had more going on instrumentally, musically, structurally.
Totally.
They had more variety, more to offer. They were filling a broader spectrum. That first album of Zeppelin, no doubt, it was awesome, but it was kind of a one flavor. It was kind
Yeah.
of like,
But that flavor was utterly innovative at the time. Right?
Fair enough.
And that's
Fair
what was
Very much.
That's what was. I mean, Led Zeppelin's musicianship. I mean, goddamn.
Because Crosby, Stills, and Nash shouldn't really have been in the running.
Come on.
Well,
that's not.
They should have been in the running,
Come on,
but
they should have
winning
totally
the
been in
award,
the
I
running.
think it's in hindsight. Obviously, we can understand if you put yourself back in the shoes of someone in 1969. It would appear that Crosby, Stills, and Nash probably stood the best chance of having longevity. Right? But you don't know that in 1969. As far as longevity, obviously I think it's Led Zeppelin, but even Chicago might have been more worthy of this award than Crosby, Stills, and Nash.
I disagree. I think. Okay, this is my first note here about Chicago Transit Authority, and it's sort of an overview of what I think Chicago 1, 2, and 3 suffered from. It was an identity crisis. They couldn't figure out exactly
That
what
was what the
hell.
time was about. Could the Beatles figure out who they were?
Well, they were well on their way at that point.
But they had
Doesn't
already.
matter.
Whatever. Okay.
Could
But
the Rascals, everybody, the Rolling Stones, everybody was
it was
dabbling.
definitely an experimental time.
We already
like
said
you
that.
said, anything goes.
Jimi Hendrix got
Right,
rid of his
but-
whole band and said, let me do something totally different.
fine. But in terms
You know?
of the conversation of best new emerging artist or
for
whatever,
a
best new album,
artist,
for a new
yes. For an
artist,
established artist, the experimentation was okay. You know, it was kind of more acceptable. But
But-
for a new artist,
all right,
I want to know who you are before you're coming on.
One
as
thing-
you're coming on. the
Chicago
scene.
was so radically different song to song,
Wait,
and even within
let me throw
their
out another
songs,
album. Hold on.
It was like a multiple personality disorder.
But,
Interesting.
all right,
And they couldn't really figure out
leaving
what their
some,
voice was.
We're leaving out, I'm sorry to talk over you. We're leaving out some key stuff from this era, from 1960, the late 60s, transitioning into the 70s. We're leaving out some key stuff. This is the genesis of progressive rock.
I don't remember you talking about progressive
Wait a
rock.
second.
I mentioned
Russian Genesis.
I thought about this earlier.
I'm actually not so much talking about Russian Genesis, although Genesis is coming right up on this
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
But yes.
yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yes, all right.
I've already thought
This
about
is a time period where progressive rock is making its entrance onto the musical scene. But before you talk about the classic progressive rock bands, you got to talk about bands like the Moody Blues. All right, that Moody Blues album with Nights in White Satin. All right, that's where progressive comes from. It comes from that English. Pink Floyd is another band we haven't even said
You
yet,
mentioned King
right?
Crimson earlier.
King Crimson, we meant right. So this is happening. So the idea that you're raising here that Chicago had to somehow create this little niche and fit into it, that's not what was happening.
That's not what I
Chicago didn't plan to become a singles band. They intentionally were being progressive at the time, even before the term progressive was in use. And that's what I was saying earlier. Is like a lot of Chicago fans will kind of try to remind the naysayers, like, hey, I know Chicago doesn't sound like Yes, but in 1969, what they were doing was essentially prog rock,
But
right?
I
and,
think
and for Chicago too.
yes, but I think Chicago's kind of take on prog rock or progressive
ended up not
rock.
lasting.
Well, it was a harder like R&B
Yeah.
swing to it than it was rock, and maybe that's what kind of skewed
Yeah.
it. You know,
I wouldn't
Essentially,
call it-
Chicago viewed themselves as a rock and roll band with horns. They were influenced by the Stax stuff. So basically, what Chicago was meant to be was something like a Sam and Dave, Soul Man, Hold On, I'm Coming. You know, like if you don't know the artist Sam and Dave, that type of thing, but with a more integrated horn section.
well, and maybe the R&B flavor is what pulled them out of the running.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
You know, and it's one of the reasons why Chicago has sort of fallen into this.
It wasn't quite so psychedelic. It wasn't
Right.
quite so
It was
hard hitting.
Not so much of anything. It was very unique. It was its own thing, and you know,
Although-
history could have been different. A lot of bands could have had horn sections, but the horn thing is what didn't catch on. Most bands who tried to have horns didn't end up catching on, and if they did, they fell much more hard into the R&B category.
Right.
Earth, Wind and Fire, Tower of Power, things like that. Right? They felt Cool in the Gang, all that fell
Now,
much
I
more into
do
the R&B
recall,
category.
I've only listened to the first maybe 3 records, 1, 2, and 3, in earnest, just kind of in the context of this kind of review and scrutinizing these records. And I do recall having a moment of like, this is totally psychedelic. Like this is, I can't remember what record it is. As we're picking through these tracks, it'll
Yeah.
come back to me, you know. And I don't know if it's on this record or maybe if it was on number 2. But I was
Probably
like,
two. Fancy Colors, I'm thinking maybe is what you might be talking about.
yes, that was a super long track, right?
Well, they have plenty of
there's
super long
like
tracks.
there's like several movements of that.
Well,
Not a fancy-
you're probably talking about Ballet for a Girl in Buchanan from Chicago.
Yeah, well,
too.
we will
You-
find
you'll
out.
find out soon enough.
But I
don't think
definitely
he's talking-
remember listening to CTA thinking, oh, I hear Hendrix.
Yeah.
You know, like I hear some Floyd stuff in there, influences that might not have been necessarily influences, but they were similar things to what was going on at the time, right? And I'm like, okay, well that guitar tone or, you know, the phrasing reminds me of this, that, or the other, you know?
They even got straight up country songs in the first 3 albums. Straight up country songs. But that was very much of the time.
Well, what
Early
I-
70s, that California country thing was coming in. The
What-
Eagles are right on the horizon.
California country.
Yeah.
That's an oxymoron.
No, it isn't. Crosby, Stills, and Nash is totally that.
No, that's folk
that LA
music.
sound.
That's folk
well,
music.
No, but the twangy guitars. I mean, that the Eagles, like I said, are about to happen.
Eagles.
And that's direct. That's like a right. That's a direct descendant of Crosby, Stills, and Nash.
I like the Eagles, but
the
no,
folk
wait.
rock thing. It ended up becoming that L.A. Take It Easy Eagles sound. That's Jackson Browne is another kind of step towards that.
And see, that's interesting because, like, the genre or the influence of country doesn't even enter my mind. Like, I was raised on country music. I wound up being a metalhead and a fucking punk rock and a hip hopper, all of the angry and angst stuff, But, like, I was raised on Conway Twitty and fucking Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, So Eagles to me isn't country. Crosby, Stills, and Nash doesn't even have country influence to my mind. It's folk, and it's. And you can't really draw
How do you
lines.
draw that kind of line? Because I hear
You can't draw lines because
I hear
the lines
like equally powered, both folk
now,
and country.
I gotta
as I'm
agree
a
with
little
Danny
more
here.
mature in my fucking perspective and my knowledge of music, I see how the lines are really kind of blurred, and you can pick just about anything out of anything else, But those things never entered my mind when I was listening to it, and even now, still, they really don't.
Neil Young doesn't strike you as a country influence artist? The band really, I would say the band kind of peaked before all this we're talking about.
I was going to say,
but
maybe Dylan,
Dylan and the band, the band was
right,
Dylan's band.
Because you say the band, which
Yeah.
leads me to Dylan, but maybe.
That was definitely influenced by country, I mean, and the Eagles kind of thing kind of grows directly out of the band.
And I
mean,
guess
it grows directly out of it.
I guess there's a point where I delineate a little further folk music from country music.
They
from
even use the
roots country, like you were
it's the
talking
word
about.
accoutrement. Like
Accoutrement.
they even use the pedal steel guitar. I mean,
yes, fair enough.
They use it frequently.
Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, there are definitely we're not on this album, but Flight
I can-
602
I can
from
see that.
Chicago.
Yeah.
What else can I say has a country tinge to it? And other
Now, as
other
far as
bands
Chicago goes, I haven't scrutinized it far
Yeah,
enough to
right,
be able
right.
to pick out the kind of
Yeah.
direct country
Crosby,
influences.
Stills, and Nash, Teach Your Children. That's a country song, man. It's a country song.
It's a folk song.
Man, that's a strange line you take in there.
Isn't it, though?
That's a strange position you're gonna hold to there.
Yeah, it's.
I mean, what about Dylan? What about Dylan? His albums, Nashville Skyline. They were the leaders of this kind of shift towards this moment of country rock. I think what we're failing to do is say country rock.
Yeah,
Chicago is jazz rock, I guess.
Sure.
They personally hate that label, but country rock is this other thing happening at the time.
I don't know why it's easier
Byrds,
for me to recognize more of a country tinge in Dylan than, say, Crosby, Stills, and Nash, or Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, or even Neil Young in and of himself, I don't know why it's easier for me to find one in the, in one and not the other,
CSN is a versatile band, no doubt about it. They have, they have an R&B influence. They have a classic rock kind of, general rock influence. From
I don't know,
time.
maybe because it's
They're
not
all
145,
alumnus. They're
maybe.
they're all parts of other classic bands. I mean, you got a Brit in there, Buffalo Springfield. I mean, to me, Buffalo Springfield. Stephen Stills and Neil Young both come from Buffalo Springfield. For what it's worth, doesn't have a country tinge to you? For what it's worth.
Yes.
That's the roots of that. That's where they're coming from. That's their band. Stephen Stills sings For What It's Worth. That's their band. I think there's a very obvious country rock thing just beginning to emerge in 1969 into 1970.
I find that this argument is very relevant to the way I perceived the first three records of Chicago's career. It's disjointed. Chicago was battling personalities. Terry Kath was his own thing.
You might say, who is this?
His songs were his songs. Peter Cetera was his own thing. His songs was his. Robert Lamb was his own thing. They didn't join together. I think, until around Chicago
Disjointed.
5.
I got something to say about that because
And
I was going to
Chicago
save
6.
this for later.
Yeah.
But Lamb wrote on the first album now. All right, now I give you on Chicago 2 and Chicago 3, it got a little more varied in terms of who wrote the songs and who sang the songs.
Yeah.
Lamb dominated the first album. All right, I got stats here. Lamb, all right, he sings lead alone on 6 of these songs.
Yeah.
He also sings lead parts on 2 other songs. He wrote 6 songs out of the 11 here. One of them was with James Pankow, but otherwise he dominated this album. Terry Kath only sang 3 leads. 2 of them were shared. He only sang 1 song by himself, Introduction. Cetera only sings 1 song, and that ain't even by himself. Cetera has 3 shared lead vocals on this, all right? His most prominent lead vocal is Question 67 68, but Lamb does have his little "It Really Doesn't Matter Anyhow" line on that, right? Kath, let's see, he writes 2 songs, and one of them is freeform guitar.
Yeah.
Which ain't a composition.
I don't even call that
Right?
a song.
That's not a song,
That's
right.
not in my list.
Well, I got it ranked, but I mean, it's spoiler alert, it's ranked last. And not that it ain't great, but it's not a composition, right? But Kath only writes 1 song on this album. Cetera does not write a song on this album.
Yeah.
Lamb dominated this album. So this lack of direction or whatever you're accusing him of on the first album alone, I'm talking.
Yeah, the first
It's
album.
sort of inaccurate.
I disagree.
Lamb, this is the product of Robert Lamb's impetus. Like he's sparking this whole thing.
Well, if that's
on
the
first
case,
album.
but the second and third album
That's
for
one
sure are
artist's
very
vision.
But the deal
And
is,
he, I'm sorry. Well, let me just say this before you, because it might
Finish.
inform what you're saying. Lamb approached this like a rare opportunity for a songwriter in a band to have 3 different singers to write for, and he deliberately wrote songs for these 3 different singers. The other ones didn't embrace that. Kath wrote for Kath. Cetera wrote for Cetera. Lamb was the one who was like, I have this incredible opportunity to write I can cast. Like, he's like a casting.
Sure.
Like when people write a script for Johnny Depp.
Sure.
You know, like Lamb approached songwriting in that way. So I think it's an unfair criticism to say that they're disjointed or whatever.
I can kind of agree with the disjointed a little bit because there are a lot of disparate sounds across the span of this first record, right? At some points, it almost doesn't sound like the same band, you know?
within the same song, many times it doesn't
That's
even
what's
sound
great
like.
about this album.
And
It kinda
maybe I
isn't,
haven't
though.
scrutinized it
I
enough to know the
disagree with you.
movements of each of the tunes, but yes, at some point, I remember thinking like, okay, well, this is so far removed from where they started,
Yeah.
you know? So I can understand what you're,
Yeah.
where you're coming from and where you're picking that out, you know?
Well,
It's
I'm right or
interesting.
wrong, but
Man,
I think it's interesting your point about like one of the 3 was like, I can write for these other guys as opposed to dude writing his tune because that's his tune. So we're going to dig into some song rankings.